Today we are talking about ecological succession. So as you guys saw in the Amoeba Sisters video, succession happens when we have a natural disaster, some kind of disturbance, or we uncover some new land, and then over time we get a new community forming. So ecological succession is the gradual regrowth of a community in a specific area. So if you look at this picture down below, it has time going to the right here. So in the beginning, there aren't a lot of species. So if there was maybe a tornado that wiped out a lot of the species, or maybe a drought, so a lot of them died, we start small. There's a few species that end up regrowing. In this case, it's plants. And we get some bigger ones, some grasses, some shrubs, then maybe some pine trees, and later on, we end up with a forest. So what I always like to talk about with ecological succession is if you look at your yard, okay, your yard's got lots of grass in it, right? Maybe some bunny rabbits. And if you look at your yard with all this grass, what's going to happen to your yard if you just let it go and you don't mow it anymore? What would happen to your lawn? It'd probably go out of control, right? The grass would get super long. Over time, some seeds might fall either from animals or from the wind, and eventually you might get some little seedlings with some trees sprouting, and over time, over hundreds of years, you might actually get a forest. So this happens in nature quite a bit. If there is a new area of land that hasn't had a lot of species on it, eventually we're going to get small species that come and colonize it first, and then bigger ones and bigger ones. So there are two types of succession. The first one is primary succession. Now, what does primary mean? Primary means first. So primary succession is the first time that we are getting life in a specific area. So primary succession happens not as often as secondary succession, and it is the development of a community in an area that has not had life before, never had life. You might be asking, well, Ms. Frankson, how could an area on Earth never had life? Everything has life on Earth. Well, true, but imagine if there is a volcano. All right, a volcano erupting and producing, wow, that's a really awful volcano. I'll redraw my volcano here. A volcano erupting and producing lava, okay? That lava has never had any life on it before, okay? So that would be an example of primary succession. Same thing if that volcano were to erupt in the ocean, which happens a lot, over time it creates an island in the middle of the ocean. That island doesn't have any life on it. The last example here is if we have a glacier, okay? So a glacier is a huge sheet of ice, and when that glacier that's been there for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, when that moves or melts, the life or the area underneath it has never had life before. So that would be another example where we get primary succession. Now, primary succession takes hundreds of years. Why? Well, if you check out this picture down here, in the beginning, it's just dirt, or sorry, it's just rock. There is no dirt, there's no soil. And in order for plants to come, we've got to create a lot of soil so that those plants can have their roots. So one of the main reasons that moss and lichen come first is because they don't need soil to have their roots in. They can live and survive just on rocks. So it takes hundreds of years for this soil to build up so that we can get those plants and then finally the animals. The second type of succession is called secondary succession. This is when is developing in an area for the second or third or fourth or fifth or 100th time. So it's the development of a community where there has been life before, and this frequently happens after there's been a natural disaster. So not a volcano or a glacier melting, but like a fire or a tornado or a flood or a hurricane, something like that. Or maybe it's just as simple as a drought, okay? So here in this picture down below, you can see nice healthy forest, and then, oh no, the fire burns down the forest, and then we get no more life here. Okay, but the key here is we still have soil. So in secondary succession, we still have the soil. And remember that soil took hundreds of years to build in primary succession. So this isn't going to take as long because we can just have seeds that come and blow in the wind. And in no time, we get a nice little forest here. So secondary succession happens a lot quicker than primary succession. It takes less time because we already have that soil built up. We don't have to make that soil from scratch. All right, so pioneer species, just like the pioneers came and they wanted to move out west to go colonize the west, pioneer species are the first to come in an area and colonize it. So after a disturbance, these guys are the first ones to come in. And typically these include moss and lichen. So moss is this spiky green stuff here. You guys have probably seen moss before on logs or in your yard or on rocks. And then lichen. So moss and lichen, they can often survive on the bare rock or bare soil. I'm not going to have you write that, but I'm going to have you write this. Moss and lichen. Lichen is actually a mutualism. So this is lichen here. It's this green stuff. You see it a lot on trees. And lichen is a mutualism. It's actually algae and fungi living together. So it doesn't look like two species, but they are, and they both help each other out. They help each other get food. And so it's a mutualism where both of them end up benefiting. So lichen and moss, and I wrote primary succession here because remember, these are the guys that come in and colonize those bare rocks. In secondary succession, we already have dirt. So a lot of times the pioneer species are just little grasses and little plants. But in primary succession, we need some species that can colonize bare rock and places that don't have a lot of soil. So lichen and moss are typically the first ones to colonize that. And then at the end, we have what's called a climax community. So if you're reading a book or watching a movie, especially an action movies always have the climax at the end. It's the part where there's all this action and everybody's running around and they're shooting and they're chasing the bad guy. It's the part with the most excitement. So the climax community is right at the end, and that's when the community has reached the final stage. Okay. Now, this isn't like, oh, it reached its final stage of life and now it's going to go be dead. No, it just means it exists there. It's going to exist like that for a while. It's not going to go into another stage. It's not going to go the other way and get smaller again. It's just going to stay and hang out like a forest. Now, this doesn't mean that it's never going to change. So we say that it's reached this steady, stable state. So lots of food webs, lots of biodiversity. It's a stable community. But it doesn't mean that it's never going to change, because if there's a big enough disturbance, all right, like a tornado, it might actually change it again, or it might wipe this out, and then we have to go back to the beginning, okay? But when we say that it reaches a steady or stable state, what we mean is that it's able to bounce back from smaller disturbances. Maybe an organism gets a disease and, or maybe hunters come in and shoot one type of organism. It's still able to bounce back. The whole food chain doesn't collapse and the ecosystem doesn't go into disarray. It's able to maintain its state fairly well. So that's an example of a climax community. And so we're going to be looking at a couple different climax communities, but it doesn't always have to be a forest. Okay? You guys are going to be looking at a pond and what happens to that pond when it reaches that climax community. So it doesn't always have to be a forest. On land, a lot of times it is a forest, but we're going to look at some other instances where it's not necessarily a forest.